Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're really immersing ourselves in Chapter 1 of Ghassan Jahar's novel, The Man Who Vanished. And it's such a brilliant starting point.
It really is. The chapter we're looking at is specifically titled The Scent Between Devotion and Desire. And, our mission for this analysis is to really dissect how the author uses these intense, highly specific sensory details.
Right, specifically rooting the whole narrative in the complex world of professional perfumery.
Exactly. Using all of that to map out this sudden, just terrifying psychological fracture of what looks like a perfectly stable life. We're essentially looking at what happens when a biologically involuntary reaction just completely collides with a carefully constructed domestic reality.
Yeah, and it is a remarkable piece of literature precisely because it operates on that biological level. I mean, we often think of our lives as these structures we govern purely through, logic and willpower.
Right.
We make choices, we build our routines, and we sort of just assume those routines form this impenetrable wall against chaos.
But Jawar's text it strips that illusion right away. He really forces us to confront how fragile our cognitive defenses actually are, especially when we're faced with sensory inputs that totally bypass our rational brain.
That concept of the impenetrable wall is exactly where we need to start. I mean, think about the routines you build. You wake up at the exact same time, you get your coffee from the same place.
Same order every day.
Right. You have this predictable evening wind down. You construct a life where nothing can surprise you, and you basically label that state of being peace.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because in this text, we meet a protagonist named Gus, who has done exactly that, but on a massive scale.
Oh, absolutely.
He's nearing 40, and
Sure.
he has completely abandoned his former career. Like, he used to exist in this corporate world, surrounded by what he calls the sterile hum of fluorescent offices.
And the cold logic of electronic circuits.
Right, all of that data and binary code. And he just walked away from all of it to open this quiet, warm, amber-lit perfume shop in a really sleepy town.
Well, the contrast Jawar establishes in those opening pages is just so structural. Gus didn't just change jobs. He essentially attempted to change his fundamental operating system.
How so?
Well, in his past life, the one governed by electronic circuits, everything was a binary outcome, right? A circuit is either closed or open, it functions or it fails.
It's very black and white.
Exactly. It's a world entirely devoid of emotional nuance. So by fleeing to this small town and surrounding himself with, fragrant oils, Gus is staging a sort of psychological rebellion against feeling numb.
Yeah, he actually states very clearly that he views himself no longer as a function of a corporate machine, but as a curator of emotion.
Right.
He calls his new life a sanctuary. He's got a wife he deeply loves, these wonderful children, and his mornings are literally defined by the smell of bread from the bakery next door.
It sounds idyllic.
It does. He specifically notes that in his shop, memories weren't data, they were stories told in scent. It's like someone fleeing a sterile, modern, smart home where everything is voice-controlled and cold to go live in this cozy, rustic cabin in the woods. He just wanted to feel human again.
He did. But that word curator is really the pivot point of the tragedy that's about to unfold.
Really? Curator?
Yeah, because think about what a curator is. A curator is someone who organizes, controls, and puts things safely behind glass.
Oh, wow.
Right. Gus believes he has mastered emotion because he literally bottles it and sells it on his own terms. He describes his wife as being as steady and grounding as the earth itself, and he calls his family his anchor.
Okay, so it's all about staying in one place.
Exactly. These metaphors, earth, anchor, curation, they all point to this profound desire for stasis. He wants everything to remain exactly where he placed it.
Okay, but wait, I want to challenge that interpretation for a second.
Sure.
Because to a lot of people listening, leaving a soul-crushing, sterile corporate job to run a cozy perfume shop and raise a family, that sounds like the ultimate healthy goal.
It does look like the dream.
Right. He literally calls his daughter's laughter the purest balm. So isn't this just a guy finding a genuine, healthy work-life balance? Why are we framing his peace as a vulnerability?
It's a fair question, but it's because peace that relies on absolute predictability is inherently brittle.
Brittle. Okay.
Yeah, the text hints heavily at this brittleness. Like, a fortress is designed for safety, obviously, but functionally, it's still a confined space. So when an individual suppresses any part of their nature that craves unpredictability or risk locking it all away to maintain this sanctuary, they create a massive psychological blind spot.
Ah,
Plus, is
ugly.
so convinced of his own stability that he completely fails to recognize the difference between being at peace and being dormant.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
And the author foreshadows this beautifully, actually. Gus himself admits in narration, right after praising his perfect life, that even the strongest foundations can develop hairline cracks.
Wow.
Yeah. He knows subconsciously that a life built entirely on just the avoidance of disruption cannot survive a real storm.
Which perfectly brings us to the exact moment the storm hits.
Yes.
The bell above his shop door chimes, a customer walks in, and Gus instantly notes that the air crackled with fresh energy. He doesn't even describe her merely as a patron. He uses words like disruption and invasion almost immediately. And her name is Lisa.
What's fascinating here is the sheer severity of the vocabulary Jawa deploys in this scene.
Right? It's really aggressive.
Objectively, this is just a retail transaction in a quiet town. But look at the words invasion, assault, storm, predator.
Yeah.
Lisa is framed structurally as an apex predator entering a very tame, highly controlled ecosystem.
Like a wolf walking into a sheep pen.
Exactly. In biology, when an apex predator is introduced into a closed environment where the native species have, lost their defensive instincts due to prolonged safety, the disruption is absolute and immediate. Gus has lost his defensive instincts.
Yeah, he actually describes her as a storm dressed in elegance. The physical descriptions are just incredibly vivid. He says she moves with a predator's grace. Her nails are painted with this blood-red polish, and she trails her fingers over his beautifully curated amber bottles as if reading them in Braille.
That visual of reading the bottles in Braille is so vital.
Why is that?
Well, it implies she operates on this deeply tactile sensory level. She isn't just standing back and visually browsing like a normal customer. She is physically touching his domain. She's tracing her way through his sanctuary.
And the red nails.
The blood-red polish against the warm amber glass serves as this visual warning sign. It's a stark, almost violent contrast to the subdued, earthy tones of his curated life.
And then she speaks. Gus notes her voice is an intimate control that seems to bypass his ears and vibrates directly against his ribs. I really want to look at the mechanics of that specific detail. Why mention the vocal range, the contralto, and the vibration in his chest?
It actually comes down to the physics of sound.
Really?
Yeah, a contralto is the lowest female singing voice, and lower frequency sound waves are longer. They carry more acoustic energy over a distance.
Okay.
So they literally penetrate physical barriers more effectively than high-frequency sounds. When Jawa writes that her voice vibrates against Gus's ribs, he's basically utilizing acoustic physics to dissolve the physical boundary between the two characters.
That is wild.
Right. Before they had even exchanged any meaningful dialogue, Lisa's physical presence is resonating inside Gus's own body. The perimeter of his fortress has been breached on a sub-audible level.
Gus definitely realizes he's losing control of his environment instantly because he throws up this defense mechanism, sort of retreating into what he calls his mask of the humble shop owner.
He's trying to hide.
Yeah, he tries to force this visceral disruption into a safe, predictable box, a simple retail transaction. He just asks her, very professionally, looking for something new.
Right. He is desperately attempting to establish the rules of engagement there. By asserting his role as the shopkeeper, he's trying to remind himself that he is the one with authority in this space. He's trying to render her harmless by categorizing her as just a customer.
But Lisa completely refuses the categorization. She replies, always, I'm looking for something unusual, something unforgettable like mine.
Yeah.
It is a completely loaded statement. And that facade Gus put up just shatters internally. His narration mentions a treacherous voice in his mind whispering back to her, you are unforgettable.
The power dynamic in the room just completely flips in that single exchange.
Yeah.
The curator is no longer curating. The moment she acknowledges her own unforgettability, she essentially strips him of his authority. He's turned from the master of the house into this captive observer. She owns the space now, and the sheer terror Gus feels stems from the realization that he's entirely complicit in handing that power over to her.
I noticed, though, the author dedicates an enormous amount of the text, like almost a full page, to breaking down the literal chemical and structural components of the perfume Lisa is currently wearing.
Yes, it's a very detailed section.
I found it initially kind of jarring to pause the tension of the scene for, a technical lesson in perfumery. Why get so incredibly technical right at the height of this interpersonal tension?
Because Jawar halts the narrative, pacing to perfectly mirror Gus's internal panic.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. When faced with an overwhelming emotional or psychological threat, A highly analytical mind will very often retreat into technical data to try and regain a sense of control.
That makes a lot of sense.
Gus tries to analyze her threat level the only way he knows how, through the architecture of her scent. But rather than calming him down, the factory analysis reveals the true depth of the danger she poses.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's walk through that specific olfactory analysis. Gus knows that her scent is a complex symphony. He identifies the top note, which is, the initial volatile impression of the perfume, as fleur d'or, which is a delicate burst of neroli and orange blossom. And he specifically tags that scent profile as innocent.
Right. In traditional perfumery, top notes are highly volatile molecules. They evaporate very quickly.
So they don't last.
Exactly. They are the introduction, the handshake, the smile. Neroli is extracted from the blossom of the bitter orange tree. It's very light, it's expensive, and it's widely associated with purity and bridal bouquets.
Okay.
Jawar is using this specific top note as a direct olfactory parallel to Lisa's social persona.
It makes me think of an architectural analogy. That delicate, expensive orange blossom top note is like the polished marble facade of a grand building.
Oh, I like that.
It's the sophisticated, elegant exterior presented to the street. Or even like someone's polished Instagram feed.
Yes, exactly.
But then Gus breathes deeper, and he smells the bass notes, which are like the damp earth and the heavy, settling foundation hidden underneath the marble. He identifies a smoky whisper of birch tar entwined with the animalic heat of castoreum.
And the transition from orange blossom to castoreum is violent.
It sounds intense.
Base notes are composed of large, heavy molecules that linger on the skin for hours, long after the innocent top notes burned away. They represent the true, lasting character of the scent. And castoreum is a notoriously difficult animalic note.
What exactly is castoreum?
Historically, it is an exudate derived from the castor sacs of beavers.
Wait, really?
Yes, it is a literal, biological glandular secretion.
So that is essentially the scent of a living, breathing, sweating creature.
It is the scent of primal biology. On its own, castoreum is harsh, it's leathery, and it's deeply unsettling. Master perfumers use it in microscopic doses to give a fragrance and underlying sensation of human heat and fierce intimacy.
Wow.
By placing birch tar and castoreum underneath the innocent orange blossom, Jawar is communicating Lisa's true nature without relying on any dialogue. She is a woman who clothes herself in societal elegance, but operates on a raw, dangerous, primal frequency.
And Gus doesn't just smell these ingredients, he interprets the biological threat. He labels it the scent of danger, describing it wrapping around him like tendrils of fog seeping into my skin, the walls, and my thoughts. This is where the biology of olfaction becomes so critical to understanding Gus's helplessness, right?
Absolutely. Because scent is the only human sense that completely bypasses the thalamus.
What does the thalamus do again?
The thalamus acts as the brain's logical switchboard. It routes visual and auditory information to the cerebral cortex for rational processing.
Okay, so it helps us think things through.
Right. Olfactory receptors have a direct, unmediated neural pathway to the limbic system, specifically the amygdala, which processes fear and emotion, and the hippocampus, which houses associative memory.
So when he smells the castoreum, he literally cannot logic his way out of the reaction. The biological response is hijacking his brain before his conscious mind can even identify the ingredients.
Exactly. Think about the irony here. He built a life, a sanctuary, entirely out of the one substance that bypasses logical defense.
Oh, man.
He thought he was the master of these oils, but he is actually standing in a room full of loaded weapons. Lisa's scent triggers his limbic system, unearthing all this buried psychological material.
Because earlier in the chapter, Gus mentioned how a rare drop of oud could evoke secrets buried deep in the earth.
Yes, and now Lisa's scent is unearthing him.
That is just brilliant. So the tension in the air, which is now heavily laden with this animal scent and acoustic vibration, finally demands a physical release. Gus hands her a paper tester strip of a new tuberose extraction.
Tuberose is a very, very deliberate choice for that moment of contact.
Why tuberose?
Well, it is a white floral, but unlike the innocent orange blossom, tuberose contains heavy concentrations of indole compounds. Yes. Indoles are found in high concentrations in decaying matter in human skin. In perfumery, tuberose is considered heavy, narcotic, and almost suffocatingly sensual.
So as he hands her this intensely sensual tuberose tester, their fingers brush. He describes the microscopic contact as electric, a jolt of static that screamed in the quiet shop. He pulls his hand back as if he's been burned. And notice the auditory word choice again. The static screamed.
Yeah.
I mean, a tiny brush of fingers produces no real sound, but in Gus's hushed, perfectly controlled life, that spark of friction is just deafening.
The static shock is the final shattering of his cognitive dissonance. The physical touch grounds the abstract tension. It forces him out of the realm of scent and imagination and squarely into physical reality.
He looks into her dark, honey eyes, and the illusion of his curated life just collapses. He notes that in that single heartbeat, he doesn't see himself as a father. He doesn't see himself as a husband. He sees himself entirely as a man. Specifically, he realizes he is a man who could still be tempted.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that realization is the core psychological fracture of the novel.
Mm-hmm.
For a decade, Gus has successfully sublimated his individual identity into functional domestic roles.
Yeah.
The provider, the anchor, the husband. He convinced himself those roles were armor.
But they weren't.
No. The static shock bypasses the armor and wakes up the biological entity beneath the titles. Realizing he can still be tempted destroys his foundation because it proves his peace was merely a suppression of his nature, not an eradication of it.
Wait, I have to play devil's advocate here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's look at this objectively. Isn't this just the most cliché midlife crisis imaginable?
I can see why you'd say that.
Right, like a guy nearing 40 gets bored, sees a beautiful, mysterious woman with red nails walk into his shop, and suddenly his loving wife and beautiful children just aren't enough for him. Why should we view Gus as this complex, tragic figure navigating a profound fracture rather than just a selfish guy looking for an excuse to blow up his life?
It is a vital question, and Jawar addresses it by focusing the narrative entirely on Gus's internal grief rather than external lust.
Internal grief.
Yeah. If this were a simple cliche, Gus's internal monologue would be fixated on Lisa's physical attributes or, a desire to possess her.
Right.
But the text pivots away from Lisa almost immediately and turns inward. Gus calls his own mind a traitorous engine.
Oh, that's a harsh way to describe your own brain.
He asks himself if he is merely a fool nearing 40, orbiting a star that didn't care who burned in his gravity. The language is steeped in self-loathing and sudden, stark doubt, not romantic anticipation.
He does start spinning these wild, detailed fantasies about her life outside his shop, though. He imagines her nights in the city, a world of melting gold and whispered promises.
But notice what he's actually fantasizing about. He's contrasting that melting gold with the slow, bakery-scented mornings of his own town.
Oh, I see.
He is mourning his unlived lives. Lisa is not the true object of his desire. Lisa is a mirror reflecting back the autonomy, the danger, and the raw youth that Gus permanently sacrificed to build his safe harbor.
Yeah, he assumes she is unattached, and he says the quiet part out loud to himself. Free in a way I wasn't allowed to be.
Exactly.
But allowed is such a tragic word choice, because he isn't a prisoner. No one forced him into the amberlit shop. He chose his wife, he chose his children, he chose this exact life to escape the corporate machine.
Yet he feels bound by those choices. The tragedy is that he recognizes his own complicity in his confinement.
Yeah.
Hunger would be to admit that his sanctuary is insufficient. The text explicitly states, calm on the outside, inside a civil war raged.
And the battle lines of that civil war are incredibly clear. Gus acknowledges that acting on this temptation means risking his entire identity as a man who honors his promises. The man who guards the fortress is at war with the man who wants to burn it down.
And a civil war is fought entirely within one's own borders. The danger isn't that Lisa is going to destroy his life. The danger is that Lisa has awakened the part of Gus that is fully capable of destroying it himself.
So what does this all mean? Because the climax of this internal warfare is juxtaposed against a surprisingly quiet external reality. The literal transaction just ends. She buys a jasmine-laced blend.
Very anticlimactic on the surface.
Yeah, but the way Gus describes taking her cash is haunting. He says the money was passed between them illicitly, a proxy for a different kind of exchange.
Because they are constrained by social convention. They cannot act on the biological override happening in the room. Therefore, the mundane exchange of currency for perfume becomes heavily loaded with subtext.
It's all beneath the surface.
Right. The innocent act of retail has been entirely corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
The money feels like a token of complicity, a stand-in for the boundary they both know is fracturing.
So she turns and leaves the shop. The bell above the door chimes again, but Gus's perception of it has totally shifted. He calls it a mournful sound. The door, he notes, sighs shut, and the shop is left in absolute crushing silence. He describes the silence as deep enough to seem unearthed.
The acoustic environment just perfectly reflects his psychological devastation. When she arrived, the air crackled with energy.
Uh,
With her departure, the energy violently evacuates the space, leaving a vacuum.
yeah.
But it isn't the peaceful silence of a sanctuary anymore. It is the ringing silence that follows a detonation.
The physical intruder has left the building, but the psychological breach remains wide open. Gus explicitly states that her perfume lingered in the air like a ghost that refused to lift. He's standing alone in the hollow space she left behind, feeling less like a man who just made a sale, and more like a man who has just been handed a prison sentence.
Because the sanctuary has turned on him. Before she walked in, the shop was his refuge from the cold logic of the world. Now he looks around at his amber bottles, and he says, "They seem to judge me now." The silence of the shop accused me. He's been placed on trial by his own environment.
He says he feels anchored by love and bound by the weight of all I stood to lose. And the context of the word anchor has completely inverted from the beginning of the chapter. Initially, his wife's love was a grounding, positive force. Now, an anchor is just a heavy piece of iron preventing a ship from moving.
Which brings us to the masterful closing line of the chapter. Gus is standing in the judging silence, breathing in the lingering ghost of birch tar and castoreum, and he admits, "A terrifying pull dragged me towards a sea I had sworn never to sail."
That is just such a good line. Let's really unpack the weight of that final metaphor. Throughout the entire text, Gus has praised the earth. He loved his wife because she was as steady and grounding as the earth. He loved Aud because it smelled of secrets buried up in the earth. The earth represents solid, predictable, foundational reality.
And the sea is the absolute antithesis of the earth.
Right.
The sea lacks a foundation. It is vast, chaotic, prone to sudden violent storms, and fully capable of drowning a person. To swear never to sail it is to make a conscious vow to remain on dry, safe land, to choose the predictable harbor over the unpredictable deep.
And yet, despite all his conscious vows, despite the walls of his sanctuary, the biological and psychological pull of the sea, the raw, uncurated chaos of true desire, is suddenly stronger than the anchor of his domestic life.
It really sets up an incredible sense of impending doom for the rest of the novel.
It really does, because Gus hasn't actually committed infidelity. He hasn't broken a single vow in the physical world.
The physical boundary is completely intact, but the psychological boundary is obliterated. The true danger of Lisa wasn't seduction. The danger was her mere existence. Her proximity held up a mirror, and Gus was forced to see that his impenetrable fortress was made of incredibly brittle glass.
It is such a haunting psychological portrait. We started this deep dive in a perfect, quiet sanctuary where memories were safely managed in amber glass. We witnessed the introduction of an apex predator wrapped in the deceptive scent of orange blossom and primal smoke. We explored the acoustic physics of a voice that bypasses physical boundaries and the neurobiology of a scent that overrides logical thought. And we ended with a man standing entirely alone, terrified by the sudden realization of his own capacity for destruction.
Jawar really just elevates a mundane retail interaction into an epic battle of the soul. He proves that our strongest intellectual defenses, our vows, and our carefully constructed routines can be bypassed entirely by the involuntary mechanics of our own biology.
Gus thought he had built a world so perfect it could keep out the chaos, only to discover that his walls couldn't keep out a ghost. So look at the routines, the daily habits, and the fortresses you have built for yourself, the predictable rhythms you rely on to feel safe. Are they truly bringing you peace? Or are they just an elaborate, beautifully scented way of hiding from a sea you are too terrified to sail? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll leave you to sit with that question.